Welcome back everybody for another President's Challenge. Now this month's President's Challenge is stemmed organic. Now if you're saying to yourself, what the heck is stemmed organic? That was my response too when I first read this. And it says here, turn an organic form such as an apple or pear with a stem. Goblets do not naturally occur in nature. So my first thought was to maybe turn a pear and use some artist paints to make it look realistic, but my skills with painting, that probably wouldn't have turned out very well. So I started thinking, what else could I do? Well, I'm taking this to mean turn something organic, meaning as long as it represents something that occurs naturally in nature, and as long as it has a stem, that would qualify. So then I thought about, what about turning mushrooms? And I thought, well, they're kind of an easy project. More like practice, and what are you going to get out of a video about mushrooms? Then I started thinking, well, maybe practice is the whole point. A lot of times as turners we're involved with something with a nice piece of wood, or maybe we're on a deadline to make a gift for somebody, or we've got a couple hours into some piece, and the last thing you want to do at that point is take risks. So you're not going to pick up that new tool and try it out, or try out a new cut. You're going to try to stay well within your comfort zone so you don't blow it and ruin this piece. But when you're doing a quick project, something like mushrooms, and you're using pretty cheap wood. In fact, I pretty much use tree trimmings to do mushrooms. There's not a whole lot invested in there. So if you take a risk with a new tool or a new cut and you blow it up, so what? Just get another piece and throw it on there. Only have about 10 minutes probably, or 15 minutes invested in the whole project. And then I started thinking, mushrooms also, there's another perspective about making a simple project like mushrooms, which is that you get to explore a lot of the attributes of the wood and start to learn how to be cognizant of how to take advantage of certain characteristics of a piece of wood. For instance, if we're going to put a little bit of a natural edge on the bark, every species of wood has a slightly different style of bark. How can we take advantage of that? Do we have contrasting heartwood and sapwood, and can we somehow artistically take advantage of that as well? We can also take advantage of flaws like cracks or insect holes. And you can also try out using some green pieces of wood. If you haven't turned green lumber before, it's a lot of fun. And as well, a lot of times when you're using branches to make things like mushrooms, you'll have a lot of irregularly shaped pieces of branches that also can result in some interesting effects. And because tree trimmings can be so readily available, you also have an opportunity to try out a lot of different species of wood that you might not otherwise be able to procure. I was easily able to get lemon, orange, pomegranate, feijoa, plum, peach, and even one of the guys, Steve from our club, gave me some camphor to try out. So let's make some mushrooms. Now first up, I have a little bit of lemonwood. Now anytime you make something with a thin stem, you always want to avoid having the pith be in the stem. The good thing about branch wood is that the pith is often offset from the center of the wood, so you can simply just pick the center of the branch as my center. Same thing here, my pith is off-centered, and so I'm going to make my actual center right there. And I'll start between centers just to get things started. This is going to be the top, so I'll put that towards the headstock for now. And so I'll need to put a tenon on this end, and then I'm going to clean it up a little bit before I turn around and put it in the chuck. Try to leave some bark around the edge around the top. And when you tend to be roughing out bark, it tends to shred. So what I want to do to make sure I don't remove bark where I want to keep it, I need to slice right across the bark. That way now when I try to remove this bark, I'm not removing bark there where I want to keep it. Now turn it around and put it in the chuck. Now the question often arises, is it better to have the head of the mushroom away from the headstock or have it over here? And it really kind of depends on the nature of the wood. If I'm going to be doing some kind of embellishment on the top of the mushroom, then there's an advantage of having the head of the mushroom, the top of the mushroom towards tailstock, because it leaves it open so we can work on it. But it makes it a bit more difficult to undercut the top. And also, if we're going to make a really thin, long, thin stem, it's a little bit harder to work in this constrained area right there. So it really depends on the piece of wood and where you're trying to go with it. So I'm going to start making the top, forming the top here. I'm going to leave a little bit of a band of the bark for the edge. We have these little white dots here. Those are power post beetle holes. So I'm going to do something about those. I'm going to turn that into an embellishment. So what I'm going to do with those is I'm going to clear them out and then fill them with something else. And this one's a little bit close to the bark, so this might be a little risky. And since most of these are on one side, just to balance it out, I'm just going to put a few extra holes in here, just to make it look. Yeah, I'll put one here, and I'll put one here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pop this right off. I'm going to leave it in the chuck, and I'm going to fill these holes with some coffee grinds. Espresso works the best because it's nice and fine. And it's inexpensive. You can usually, if you're doing coffee, you usually have some of this lying around. Just going to work it into the holes and make sure it's packed really tightly. Somewhere here I have a little toothpick cut back just on the tip so it's not too sharp. I'm going to use that as a plunger to make sure these coffee grinds go right down into those holes. And now to set the coffee beans, I'm just going to flood the whole area. I find because this is end grain, it'll absorb anything. So instead of just trying to do the dots, I usually just flood the whole area with some CA glue. Let that soak right into all those holes. And the other thing is, sometimes it's hard not to get it on the bark. And if that happens, if you get it on the bark, it's not going to be easy to clean off. So what I do is I just put it on the whole edge of the bark. That way at least the bark's all going to look the same. And we'll just set this aside to dry. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. Next up, I have a piece of Feijoa wood, also known as pineapple guava. I have this growing in my yard. And I think what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to go try to make a really thin stem on this one. Also, even though I'm spoiled and I have a lot of chucks, I'm gonna pretend that I only have this one chuck. So I'm also that will give me an excuse to show you an alternative way of chucking small work like this. It's actually pretty neat. I learned it. It's something based on something I saw Richard Raffin do in one of his videos. So once again, I'll start between centers, and what I'm going to do before I get started, I'm actually going to use my calipers. And I'm going to measure the Morse taper just as it's going into my spindle right there. And I want to remember that diameter. And what I'm going to do for my tenon Okay, right about the center of this tenon, I'm going to mark that diameter that I took right off the Morse paper. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm turning this into a wooden Morse taper. You can kind of see where it's going now. That'll be the bark I'm trying to save, so I can go ahead and rough out some of this while I have it decentered. So now when I turn it around, I basically have a wooden Morse taper that I'm going to put right into the Morse taper on my spindle. And I'll bring the tailstock in to recenter it. Press it in a little bit. That's just, whoops, just enough to center it, and I'll lose the live center on the tailstock. And I'm going to use the tailstock to push that in pretty tight. And one little extra thing I find helps out, just to make sure it's seated all the way in, I'm going to take a skinny parting tool. I'm going to take off a little bit right up against there. And using a mallet, or the mallet that came with my lathe, see if I can get it to go in just a little bit more, just like that. And that it's not going anywhere. I've done a lot of urchin ornaments with this technique, and very rarely do you have this pop out once it's in tight like that. And the whole reason I want to have the top of the mushroom on this end this time is because I'm going to thin this out quite a bit. And so I don't want this extra mass at the end here with this being really thin, spinning around really fast. As this gets longer and thinner, there's a chance it might snap. But if I have a long thin spindle hanging out here, not so much. And the tool I'm going to use, I'm also going to switch up tools, since one of the purposes of doing this is to try out new tools. And one of my favorite tools for doing small spindles like this is a 1/4 inch round skew. Really useful for doing this kind of small work. One of the nice things about a 1/4 inch round skew is that because the fulcrum on the tool is right in the center all the time, no matter where you cut on the cutting edge, you're never very far from the fulcrum, so you really don't have to worry about leverage issues. So it's a very tame skew. In fact, I need to put on my list of videos, we should cover this tool one time. I did do a demo at my local club and a couple other clubs on how to make this tool and how to use it. It's a shop-made tool made from a 1/4 inch length of high-speed steel. It's a really fun tool. Also, one of the advantages of chucking directly into a Morse taper like this with small work is a lot of times you need to get your hand in here close to support the work. And when you have a big chuck spinning around, you might have sharp edges on it, and that would be kind of painful. So with this kind of setup, I don't have that problem. And a lot of times I'll need to get really close, and I'll put my armpit right on top of my headstock, and I really can't have that big chuck in the way while I'm doing something like that. So this is now the bottom of the top. So I'm going to try to use peeling cuts to undercut my lid. And of course that might not leave a good surface, so I might see what else I have here. Arsenal. Maybe since it's end grain, it'll respond well to scraping, so let me see if I can finish this up with a point tool. That's another tool, maybe we'll put that on the list too. This is another shop-made tool. It's never a primary tool, but it's a really nice supporting actor. It gets you out of a lot of trouble in certain situations. It comes in really handy as a supporting tool. And I'm not going to fuss too much with sanding because these are just little mushrooms. But I'll give it some sanding here. Because this is pretty small, it sands up pretty quickly. Notice when you sand something thin, it's also good to support it, just like when you're cutting. So I have my thumb against the back side. Otherwise, I could bend it too much and have it snap. Whoops. Go back here. And since it's a long spindle, I'll go with the grain just a little bit. It hides a lot of those scratches. Now all we got to do, essentially turn a bead on the head. Hopefully I don't get a catch. 4-inch gouge would be a little safer here. There it is. Now a little tip, a lot of times you can see as this broke off it left some tear out. That's why I always do just a little bit of an extra nib there. It makes it much easier. I can just take a chisel or my skew for that matter and I can just clean that up at the end. That way I don't have the tear out. Alright, the glue is dry on that lemon wood, so let's bring that one back. And now we're going to need to clean up this end right here. And I don't want to take off too much. And I'm just going to clean away the glue. I'm going to leave the glue on the bark. That looks pretty good. Sand this a little bit. And we have a nice polka dotted top for our mushroom. Alright, now all we gotta do is manage to do the whole stem without snapping it off. But again, if we do, no big deal. Trying to get under cut here, so I'm actually going to try, it's another opportunity to try something. I'm actually going to try to use my gouge left-handed. Whoops. Don't catch. Couple of tips when you're trying to part something off. When you peel across the end grain on the side here, it tends to be a little bit rough. And you have a couple of options. One is you can actually bring the parting tool up and actually use the corner to scrape, just push directly in, or take a very light cut just to clean up the bottom. The other thing, to avoid having that, to peel away or dealing with that tear out, I always, once again, leave a little bit of an extra nub right here, so that if it breaks off, it's going to break off a little bit away from the piece. So I'll have something to peel back, not have to deal with the tear out. And I can just pare away that nub. Alright, I think we have time for just one more. This is a slightly larger piece of peachwood. I think what I'm going to do with this one, I'm going to try to offset the stem quite a bit. So the pith is here, the edge of the wood is there. I'm going to go about 1/3 over, so my stem is actually going to be right about there, and I'll mark the same on this end too. So this is sort of, it's not exactly multi-axis because I'm only doing one axis, but it is an offset axis. So the piece is going to be a little bit off-centered. We have an interesting problem right here. I'm trying to rough this out, but I've got this little knot right there. Now normally, along spindle work, I have the grain running this way. And so I want to use a wide cutting angle, or maybe up to about 45 degrees. But here, this is actually end grain coming out, so I don't want to try to do my normal thing on spindle work, because that's going to catch just like it would if I was cutting across end grain. So here we have this interesting exception where, in order to just to rough this out, I actually want to use a narrow cutting angle just to remove that little knot. I'll have a lot less trouble. So we've gotten rid of that knot. And make myself a little tenon right here. Let's turn this around and chuck it up. At this point we are going against the grain, because as I start to dish this out, it becomes an inside surface. So as I get close to my final surface, I'm going to want to, just like we did in against the grain, you need to speed up, give it a little extra speed, take a nice light cut. That should take care of any potential tear out. We weren't going really strongly against the grain to begin with. It's not like as soon as you go against the grain it starts tearing out. It's a matter of degree. So usually if you're only going against the grain a little bit, usually not a problem. Alright, not too bad. For about a half an hour I managed to make 3 different mushrooms. Got a chance to use a variety of tools. I haven't used my skews in a while, especially my 1/4 inch round skew that I used to make the really thin stem. Even brought out the bidan and my negative rake scrapers for cleaning up the surfaces on the offset mushroom as well. We got to touch on a few techniques, a couple of ways of mounting, especially using that Morse taper to mount a thin spindle, as well as some undercutting and even cutting air on that offset mushroom. And we got to take advantage of some of the features of the wood. All of them I left some of the bark around the little edge. I always find it looks nice on a mushroom to leave a little bit of a natural edge around it. And with the lemonwood, with those powder post beetle holes, we drilled them out and we have little polka dots on top of there. You can also, there's some other ones I did off camera. I had one piece of birch that was just full of cracks, and I filled all the cracks in with coffee, and also I let the coffee stain the surface so it looks like the top of the mushroom is a different color than the bottom one. In fact, this probably looks the most like a real mushroom than anything else. It looks kind of like a portobello but with a white edge. Alright, that does it for another President's Challenge. So go out and make some mushrooms. If you don't have any branches, go cut some branches off some trees in your yard. Use those. See what you can come up with. And if you come up with some really neat ideas, send some pictures. We want to share by all means. So with that, until next time, I'm Brian Havens, and thanks for watching.